In this video, we will be presenting what a dipper line is. You'll be learning about the characteristics of a dipper line, what some of the typical lengths to design for, the diameter, various materials that may be selected in order to optimize the dipper line that's installed. We will explain how to install a dipper line and also provide practical explanations of some challenges that you may encounter, some solutions, and what to watch out for going ahead.
What is a dipper line? Well, a dipper line is nothing else but actually just an access tube through the sealed wellhead dedicated to measure water levels, either manually or by means of instrumentation. Very often it is not existing, so you will just find a sealed wellhead where you cannot measure any water levels. Now imagine we don't have a dipper line to allow for any measurement instrument to go in. What would happen is that then we would perhaps just take our measurement device into the borehole, and what will happen is that it will get just tangled up and get stuck. The good thing about dipper lines missing is that you can add it at a later stage. But why is it important to measure water levels? Well, it is extremely important to measure water levels for the day-to-day operation, to ensure that the pump doesn't run dry or that you don't have any problems with the well itself. But it's also a prerequisite for sustainable water management.
The criteria for the length of the dipper line is essentially defined by the configuration of the borehole where you're installing the dipper line. It's good to remember that the dipper line is always submerged in water. It will be not only below the static level, which is when the pump is off, but it'll even be below the dynamic level, which is when the pump is on. The best way to look at it is the maximum length of the dipper line is the pump depth, while the minimum length of the dipper line is the dynamic water level. This is in theory. However, really in practice, there needs to be an additional buffer or margin for a factor of safety to ensure that the dipper line is always submerged. However, you also have to balance that with the longer the dipper line is, the more expensive it is to purchase a dipper line. So a really good practice that we recommend is to take the static and the dynamic level, take the difference between those two elevations and divide by 2 for the additional amount of length that you need to add to the dipper line in addition to the dynamic level elevation.
So what about the dipper line diameter? Basically, the dipper line diameter, it is constrained by the rising main diameter, which is the rising main that is attached to the pump, and the casing diameter. The difference between the two is the maximum space you have to install this tube along the rising main. So basically it is something that is given by the well characteristics. So how does this is the maximum available space in theory. So if we want to know the dipper line diameter, it has to be smaller or equal to the casing diameter minus the rising main diameter divided by 2, because we have the same annulus around the whole rising main, and then we usually have to add at least another ½ an inch, because you can't just fill up the whole space. It will get stuck during installation. So common dipper line diameters are 3/4 of an inch, 1 inch, or 1.5 inch. The ideal diameter is 1 inch, because it will allow you to install most of the instrumentation that is available on the market, and also easily allows manual measurements.
In this section, we'll look at the characteristic of material for the dipper line. The most important feature of your dip line material should be that there is no reaction to water, and ideally you want it to be inexpensive. So for that reason, the most common type of dipper line material used is polyethylene that's coiled like this one here. The advantage of coiled pipe is that there's no connections. It's one solid monolithic piece. There's no couplings and nothing for instrumentation to get hung up on. It's very smooth walled. It's easy to store also on the site. They're usually in big rolled coils and they're inexpensive and easy to purchase and usually available in most markets. The disadvantages of using a coiled dip line is that they're not straight, and even if you straighten out this piece, it'll still have a bit of memory and it'll have waves during installation. So for that reason, you want a bit of space, a little bit of buffer, more than the margin that we spoke about before, between the casing and the rising main when you're using coiled pipe. In contrast, you can also buy threaded sticks, and the advantages to using threaded sticks for dip lines is they're very light, they're easy to install, so you can install this manually, whereas for large coils of up to 300 meters, you would need equipment to move that large coil. These sticks can be moved around the construction site, they're light and easy, they're also very straight.
So now we're going to talk about the installation of a dipper line, assuming that we've already defined the length and the diameter. One of the main aspects, of course, of dipper line installation, since they're installed along the rising main, is that it can only be done when the pump is removed. So try to plan ahead if you want to install a dipper line at a later stage, to try to coordinate it with a maintenance action. But now, if you've, in an example, when you start to reintroduce your pump after having taken it out to be allowed to install the dipper line itself, and you've defined the depth to which the dipper line shall go, which in this case would be 100 meters, you know that the pump will be situated at 120. You have to make sure that as you are introducing the pump, that you start installation at 20 meters to be sure that the length is appropriate at the very end.
For the installation of the dip line, in preparation for including the dip line, you'll want to drill some small holes into the end of the dip line. You never want to cap the dip line, you want to make sure that it's open. However, you also want to protect that the actual device doesn't fall through your instrumentation. So the easiest way to do that is just to take some zip ties and insert them in the holes that you've just drilled. And there you go. You have a basket that can allow for free flow of water. If we were to use the example as before of having the dip line installed 20 meters above the pump, so you have the pump, the rising main, and the cabling. Let's pretend that instead of 20 meters, this is it's really 20 centimeters, but what we want to ensure is that the dip line is installed with the shadow of the cabling adjacent to it, and when you tie on with these zip ties, you need to ensure that the zip ties are in the shadow of the cabling and the dipper line, but also ensure that these locking mechanisms on the zip ties are not on the top of the dip line, but also in the shadow as well. And then every meter or so, you'll continue up based on the distance of your dip line as you reinstall the borehole pump.
So now we are just about to introduce the pump into the well together with the dipper line, and as we just saw before, they're attached the dipper line onto the rising main with the electrical cable here in the shadow. Now this is the cable that holds the weight of the pump, and you have to make sure that you never attach the cable binders along with the cable holding the weight of the pump, because this will make the cable binders burst, and then there's nothing left to hold the dip line and it will fall into the bottom of the hole. So now that the dipper line has been lowered to the correct position, of course the finish of the wellhead, which you don't see here, is usually a steel cap that is completely sealed to ensure that nothing can fall into the borehole. What will be required in addition to the opening in the steel capping for the electrical cable is an additional opening to allow the dipper line to come out, and that is how you can then access the groundwater through with measuring devices. So in conclusion to this dipper line explanations that we have given here now, we can say that of course if you don't have a dipper line, plan for it carefully and try to optimize the length, meaning try not to have a dipper line that is too long, but at the same time try to have a dipper line with a largest possible diameter. In conclusion, for a dipper line, it is best the shorter it is, the larger diameter it is, and being coiled, meaning continuous.